I told myself it was nothing. Just a glance. A fleeting, accidental meeting of eyes in a quiet house. But when I walked past him that morning, wearing something I shouldn't have, his gaze followed me, slow and deliberate. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper, something I felt in the air between us, like an unspoken challenge. And for the first time in years, I didn't know if I wanted to step back or step closer. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of quiet day I used to enjoy. The house was still. The faint sound of birds outside the only noise, and I was savoring the rare stillness. Ethan had been staying with me for a few weeks now, filling the space James had left behind in ways I hadn't expected. I'd thought it would be temporary, just until he figured out his next steps after finishing grad school. But even in such a short time, his presence had changed the house, brought life back into it. And, I hated to admit, brought something else back into me. That morning, I hadn't thought much about what I was wearing. A silk robe, one James had bought me years ago, the kind that clung to the skin in soft waves. It wasn't revealing, not exactly, but it was more intimate than anything I usually wore around the house. I wasn't expecting to see Ethan at that hour, assuming he'd still be asleep. But as I walked out of my room, cup of tea in hand, there he was, standing at the end of the hallway. He was leaning against the wall, barefoot, a mug in one hand. The faint smile on his lips froze the moment I stepped into view. His gaze drifted over me, lingering just a second too long before meeting mine. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes gave him away. "Good morning," I replied quickly, clutching the tea like a lifeline and moving past him. I could feel his gaze follow me, heat rising in my cheeks as I escaped into the kitchen. My heart was pounding in a way I couldn't explain, my body hyper-aware of the encounter. It was nothing, I told myself again. Just a look. But that look stayed with me all day. Ethan had always been polite, reserved even. He was nothing like James, who was brash and charming and knew how to command a room. Ethan was quieter, more thoughtful, the kind of person who listened before he spoke. It had taken years for him to warm up to me when James and I first married. By the time he left for college, we'd settled into a comfortable, if distant, understanding of each other. But the man who returned to my house after James's death wasn't the same boy who'd left. Ethan had grown into himself. He was confident now, more self-assured. And there was something about him that unsettled me in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just his looks, though I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed. His broad shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. It was all impossible to ignore. But it was more than that. It was the way he filled the house, his presence quiet but undeniable. The way he made me feel seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years. And now, with that lingering look from the hallway replaying in my mind, I felt like something had shifted. I tried to shake it off as the day went on, throwing myself into tasks I didn't really need to do. I cleaned the kitchen twice, reorganized the pantry, even spent an hour in the garden pulling weeds. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. That evening, we sat down for dinner together. Something we'd fallen into the habit of doing since he'd moved in. The conversation was light, easy, but I couldn't help noticing the way his eyes lingered on me when I spoke. "You've been busy today," he said, his tone casual as he leaned back in his chair. I shrugged, keeping my gaze fixed on my plate. "Just trying to stay productive." His lips quirked into a small smile. "You don't always have to keep yourself busy, you know?" The comment caught me off guard. I looked up, meeting his gaze across the table. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," he said quickly, but his expression softened. "It's just, you deserve to take a break sometimes." The way he said it, so sincere and gentle, left me momentarily speechless. I forced a smile, changing the subject quickly, but his words lingered long after dinner was over. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Ethan had looked at me in the hallway that morning. The intensity of his gaze, the way it had made me feel both vulnerable and alive at the same time. It was a feeling I hadn't expected. One I wasn't sure I wanted, but it was there, undeniable, and no amount of reasoning could make it go away. The days that followed were a careful dance, though I wasn't sure who was leading. I told myself to keep my distance, to maintain the boundaries that had always been there. But Ethan's presence was magnetic, and no matter how hard I tried, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain or justify. It started with the little things. He began joining me in the garden, offering to help pull weeds or trim back the hedges that had grown wild since James passed. At first, I thought it was just politeness, a way for him to pass the time. But then there were the moments that lingered, the ones that felt like they meant something more. One afternoon, I was kneeling in the dirt, tugging at a stubborn weed, when Ethan crouched beside me. His hands were rougher than I expected as they brushed against mine, taking hold of the same root. "Here," he said softly. "Let me." I let go, watching as his strong hands worked the weed free from the soil. When he looked up at me, there was a faint smile on his lips, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest. "You make it look easy," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It's all about the angle," he replied, his smile widening. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the sunlight casting golden highlights in his hair. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I murmured, turning back to the garden. But I could feel his gaze on me, and it made my hands tremble. That evening, after dinner, we sat together in the living room. The storm outside had settled into a steady rain, the sound of it tapping against the windows. Ethan was stretched out on the couch, flipping idly through a book, while I sat in the armchair with a cup of tea. "I don't know how you stay so calm," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" He closed the book, his gaze meeting mine. "This house, it's so quiet. Doesn't it ever get overwhelming?" I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the mug. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I'm used to it." Ethan nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I don't think I could do it. I need noise, movement, something to keep my mind busy." I smiled faintly. "That's why you're always fixing things, isn't it?" He chuckled. "Maybe." There was a pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken words. "I didn't mean to bring it up," he said finally, his tone softer. I don't know. I feel like you deserve more than this." The sincerity in his voice took me off guard. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "More than what?" "This," he said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "This quiet, this loneliness. You deserve to feel alive." The word hit me like a jolt, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "I'm fine, Ethan," I said quickly, setting the mug down and standing. "You don't need to worry about me." But as I walked past him, I could feel his eyes on me, steady and unflinching. The next day, I found Ethan in the garage, sorting through a pile of old tools that had belonged to James. He looked up when I stepped inside, his expression softening. "Need something?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "No," I said, hesitating in the doorway. "I just wanted to see what you were up to." He smiled, setting down the wrench he was holding. "Just trying to make sense of all this. Your husband kept everything." I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the shelves lined with jars of nails and screws, half-empty cans of paint, and tools that hadn't been touched in years. "He always said you never know when you might need something," I said softly. Ethan laughed. "Sounds like him." For a moment we stood in silence, the weight of James's absence settling over us. Then Ethan turned to me, his gaze steady. "Do you miss him?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Every day," I admitted. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I do too." I looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "You don't talk about him much," he shrugged, his eyes dropping to the floor. "It's hard. He wasn't around a lot when I was growing up, but he tried in his own way." "He loved you," I said quietly. Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "I know," he said, "and I think he'd want you to be happy." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I felt Ethan's presence before I heard him. He stepped into the room, leaning against the counter as he watched me. "You don't have to do all that," he said, his voice low. "I don't mind," I replied, not looking at him. There was a pause, the kind that made the air between us feel heavy. "Elise," he said softly, and the way he said my name made me stop. I turned to him, my heart pounding. "What?" He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "You don't always have to do it alone." I didn't know what to say. The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at me, it was too much. I turned back to the sink, my hands trembling as I picked up a plate. but his words stayed with me long after he'd left the room. I couldn't stop thinking about what Ethan had said the night before. You don't always have to do it alone. The words had settled into my chest like a weight, impossible to ignore. I'd spent so many years convincing myself that I was fine, that I didn't need anyone. But now, with Ethan here, that lie felt harder to maintain. He was in the house more than usual that week, working on small projects he'd taken upon himself. Fixing a broken cabinet door, organizing the tools in the garage. His presence was steady, grounding, and yet it left me feeling unmoored. One night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house fell into its usual stillness, I found myself wandering into the living room. Ethan was there, sprawled across the couch, his long legs stretched out and a book resting on his chest. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across his face, and for a moment I just stood there, watching him. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and quiet. I shook my head, stepping further into the room. "Not really." He sat up, placing the book on the coffee table. "Want to sit?" I hesitated for only a moment before sinking into the armchair across from him. The silence between us was heavy, the kind that felt like it was waiting for someone to break it. "I was thinking about James today," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What about him?" "Just how he used to fill this house. It feels so quiet without him." Ethan's gaze was steady, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. "It doesn't feel quiet to me," he said softly. I looked at him, my breath catching in my throat. There was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me, that made the air between us feel charged. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. When he stood, crossing the room to kneel in front of my chair, my heart leapt into my throat. His hand reached for mine, his touch warm and steady. "Elise," he said, my name a quiet plea on his lips. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "Tell me I'm not imagining this," he said, his voice raw. I couldn't say it, because it wasn't true. I wasn't imagining it, and neither was he. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Neither do I," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about you, about us." The words sent a shiver through me, and before I could stop myself, my free hand reached up to touch his face. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and when they opened again, they were filled with so much longing it made my chest ache. "Ethan, we can't," I started, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. "Why not?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because it was wrong. Because it was complicated, because it could ruin everything." But none of those reasons felt strong enough to make me pull away. The next day, I did everything I could to avoid him. I threw myself into chores, cleaning rooms that didn't need cleaning, and reorganizing the pantry for the third time that month. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch. The way he'd looked at me, like I was the only thing that mattered. By mid-afternoon, the tension was unbearable. I found myself in the study, rearranging books on the shelves in a desperate attempt to keep my hands busy. "Do you need help with that?" Ethan's voice came from the doorway, and I jumped, the book in my hands slipping to the floor. "No," I said quickly, bending to pick it up. "I've got it." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. "Elise, we need to talk." "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, turning back to the shelves. "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Because..." I trailed off, my hands trembling as I placed the book on the shelf. "Because you're scared," he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, my back against the bookshelf. "Of course I'm scared," I said, my voice rising. This isn't supposed to happen." "But it did," he said, his voice calm, "and pretending it didn't won't make it go away." I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He stepped closer, his hands bracing against the shelf on either side of me, trapping me in place. "Elise," he said softly, his voice a whisper against my skin. "Just tell me you don't feel the same, and I'll walk away." I couldn't say it because it wasn't true. Instead, I reached up, my hand trembling as it rested against his chest. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't have to do anything," he said, leaning in until our foreheads touched. "Just let me in." And I did. That evening the storm returned, rain pounding against the windows as thunder rolled in the distance. We sat on the couch together, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "No," I said honestly. He nodded, his expression softening. "Neither do I." The tension between us was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a burden, and more like a promise. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. And when he leaned in, pressing his lips to mine, I didn't stop him. The house was quiet that night, the storm outside subsiding into a steady drizzle. I sat in the living room, a book in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in over an hour. My mind was elsewhere. On him, on the moments we'd shared, on the way his gaze made me feel like I was coming undone. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Ethan walked into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that was impossible to ignore. He was barefoot, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a quiet intensity in his expression that made my heart race. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, setting the book aside. "No, you?" he shrugged, leaning against the doorway. "Not really." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, thick with everything we hadn't said. "Ethan," I began, but he interrupted me. "Can I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the spot beside me on the couch. I hesitated, my chest tightening, but I nodded. He sat down, leaving just enough space between us to make the silence feel unbearable. I could feel the heat of him, the way his presence seemed to draw me in like gravity. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I turned to him, my breath catching in my throat. "About what?" "You know what," he said, his gaze meeting mine. I looked away, my hands twisting in my lap. "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can," he said gently, reaching out to take my hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "Just tell me how you feel." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "It's complicated," I said finally. "I don't care," he replied, his voice soft but resolute. I looked up at him, my eyes burning with unshed tears. "It's not that simple, Ethan. It's wrong." "Why?" he asked, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. "Because other people might not understand? Because it scares you? Because it scares me too, Elise. But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I felt my walls cracking, the carefully constructed defenses I'd built over years of loneliness beginning to crumble. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. "Just tell me to stop," he murmured. "If you don't feel the same, just say the word, and I'll leave you alone. But if you do..." I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell him to stop because I didn't want him to. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a tentative kiss. It was soft, hesitant, but the second his hand came up to cup my cheek, it deepened. Years of longing, of loneliness, of denying myself the chance to feel alive again, all of it poured into that kiss. His hands were gentle but insistent, his touch igniting something in me I thought had died a long time ago. We didn't make it upstairs right away. The living room became a blur of soft whispers and quiet gasps, our movements slow and deliberate as we explored the boundaries we'd both been too afraid to cross. By the time we made it to my bedroom, the rain outside had picked up again, the sound of it tapping against the windows as lightning flashed in the distance. Ethan paused at the doorway, his gaze searching mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I said, the word leaving my lips without hesitation. The next moments unfolded with a tenderness that took my breath away. Ethan's touch was reverent, his movements deliberate, as if he was afraid I might vanish if he wasn't careful. I let myself surrender to him, to the way he made me feel seen and wanted in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a connection that felt impossibly deep, like we were both finding something we hadn't even realized we'd lost. When it was over, we lay tangled together beneath the sheets, the room bathed in the soft glow of the storm outside. Ethan's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "Yes," I said softly. He pressed a kiss to my forehead, pulling me closer. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I don't care how complicated it is, I just want to be with you." Tears stung my eyes, and I buried my face against his chest. I don't know what happens next, I admitted, my voice trembling. We'll figure it out, he said, his tone steady, one step at a time. I woke before the sun, the house still shrouded in the soft gray light of dawn. For a moment, I stayed still, listening to the rhythmic sound of Ethan's breathing beside me. His arm was draped over my waist, his warmth a steady presence against the cool morning air. The events of the night before felt like a dream, fragile and surreal, but the weight of his hand on my hip and the way his chest rose and fell told me it was real. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, guilt, fear, and something dangerously close to joy. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him. Pulling on my robe, I padded to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. The house felt different this morning, quieter in a way that wasn't unsettling, but peaceful. I brewed a pot of coffee, the scent filling the air as I leaned against the counter, staring out the window. The garden glistened with dew, the daisies Ethan had teased me about still standing tall in the early light. Last night, I had let my guard down completely, and now I wasn't sure how to put it back up. Everything felt so precarious, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully see. Morning. His voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway. His hair was tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a softness in his eyes that made my chest ache. Good morning, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He walked over to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against the opposite side of the kitchen island. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us filled with everything we hadn't said. Are you okay? He asked finally, his tone careful. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth. Are you? He smiled faintly, setting his mug down. I am if you are. The simplicity of his words made my throat tighten, and I looked down at the counter, my fingers tracing the edge of the mug in my hands. I don't know what happens now, I admitted. Neither do I, he said, his voice steady. But I don't regret it, Elise. Not for a second. I looked up at him, his words sinking into my chest like a balm. I don't regret it either, I said softly. The relief in his expression was palpable, and he stepped around the island, closing the distance between us. His hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine as he squeezed gently. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice calm and sure. I nodded, holding onto his hand like it was the only thing keeping me steady. Later that morning, I sat on the porch with my second cup of coffee, the sunlight warming my skin as I watched Ethan in the garden. He was pulling weeds, his movements deliberate as he worked to tame the wild overgrowth. The sight of him there, so natural and at ease, brought a small smile to my lips. The guilt wasn't gone. It lingered at the edges of my mind, a quiet reminder of the line we'd crossed. But alongside it was something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The path ahead of us was uncertain, filled with questions I didn't have the answers to. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid to face it. As I sat there, the sound of birds in the distance and the gentle hum of the world waking up, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to feel alive again. It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon when it all began. The light filtered through the lace curtains of my living room, scattering patterns across the coffee table where I'd carelessly left a book I now regret placing so brazenly in plain sight. The cover was striking, crimson letters spelling out a title that left little to the imagination. Desires of the Middle-Aged Heart. I was in the kitchen preparing tea when Julian walked in. He wasn't supposed to be home. College classes usually kept him out until late evening, but there he was, tall and lean, with that boyish curiosity that always made him look younger than his 21 years. He paused by the table, his gaze locking onto the book. I caught the moment from the corner of my eye, his brow furrowing in surprise before one of his lips curled upward in what could only be described as a smirk. Interesting choice, he remarked, holding up the book. His tone was casual, but his eyes flickered with amusement. Or was it something else? I felt heat creep up my neck. It's research, I lied, turning to face him. I'm editing it for a client. Really? He flipped through the pages, skimming a paragraph before closing it with a deliberate snap. Looks more like inspiration than research. I laughed, though it came out too forced to be convincing. Don't judge a book by its cover. But his smile lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was judging much more than the book. He set it back down, his fingers brushing against the table for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, before walking away with that same smirk. As the door to his room clicked shut, I exhaled, trying to steady the unease bubbling in my chest. It wasn't the book itself that bothered me. It was how he looked at it. At me. Like he saw something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. That moment marked the beginning of something I never anticipated. Something I couldn't have stopped even if I'd tried. Looking back, I wonder if I left the book there on purpose. If some part of me wanted him to find it, to look at me in a way that no one else had in years. My days had fallen into a predictable rhythm. Mornings started with a steaming cup of coffee, followed by hours spent hunched over manuscripts. My red pen circling errors and suggesting improvements. Being a freelance book editor had its perks. Flexibility, solitude, but it also left me craving something I hadn't quite been able to name. Perhaps that's why I'd been so careless with the book that Tuesday. Julian had moved back in a few months earlier. He needed a place to stay while finishing his final year of college, and I couldn't refuse. It was a big house, far too empty since Charles, my late husband, passed away. I told myself it was nice having someone around again, even if Julian and I had never been particularly close. Our interactions were polite but sparse. He was often buried in his coursework or out with friends. I gave him space, and he returned the favor. But after the book incident, something shifted. The following morning, as I sat at the dining table editing a particularly dull manuscript about corporate leadership, Julian walked in. He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair still messy from sleep. I barely glanced up, expecting the usual quick grab of cereal before he disappeared. Instead, he lingered. "About that book," he started, leaning casually against the counter. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. "What about it?" He shrugged, but his eyes betrayed a spark of curiosity. "I looked it up. Seems different from the stuff you usually work on." I sighed, setting the pen down. "Not every project can be thrilling, Julian. It's just another job. Right?" He nodded, but didn't leave. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from me. "So what's it about?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "It's a novel about relationships, exploring connections later in life." "Relationships, huh?" He smirked, and I felt my cheeks flush. "Yes," I replied sharply, hoping to end the conversation. But Julian didn't seem deterred. "You know," he said after a long sip of coffee, "I think people underestimate how complex relationships can be at any age." His tone was casual, but there was something in the way he spoke that made my stomach twist. I forced a smile, brushing off his comment as a passing observation, but as the days went on, I noticed him watching me more closely. One evening, I caught him in the living room. He was sprawled out on the couch with his laptop, but on the coffee table sat my book. He wasn't reading it, but its presence there felt deliberate, like a silent challenge. "Are you enjoying my things now too?" I asked, half joking as I entered the room. He glanced up, unbothered. "Just curious, you left it out again." I crossed my arms. "It's not exactly your type of reading material. Maybe I'm expanding my horizons." His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, the room felt too small. I tried to laugh it off, muttering something about him needing to expand his horizons elsewhere, but the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it lingered, growing heavier with each passing interaction. By the end of the week, I started catching myself thinking about Julian at odd moments. It wasn't just the way he looked, though he was undeniably handsome with his sharp features and confident posture. It was his sudden attentiveness, the way he seemed to notice things no one else did. Like the day he commented on my hair. I'd spent a little extra time brushing it out, hoping to feel less invisible. "Your hair looks nice like that," he said as he passed me in the hallway. It was a simple remark, but it caught me off guard. "Thank you," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. These moments were small, insignificant on the surface, but they piled up like drops of water filling a glass. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. But deep down, I knew something had shifted between us. The household wasn't as quiet as it used to be, and it wasn't just because Julian was home. It was the unspoken words, the lingering glances, and the way my pulse quickened when I caught his eye. It was late one evening when I found Julian in the living room again. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I had been working in my study but decided to stretch my legs and get a glass of water. Passing by, I saw the glow of a lamp illuminating his face as he sat on the couch, the book open in his hands. For a moment, I froze in the doorway, my breath catching. He hadn't just been flipping through the pages. He was reading it, his brow furrowed in concentration. I could see the slight movement of his lips as he silently mouthed the words, an unconscious habit he'd had since he was a boy. "Interesting bedtime story?" I asked, leaning against the frame, trying to sound nonchalant. He looked up, startled but quickly recovered. "It's different," he admitted, closing the book but keeping his thumb between the pages. "A lot more honest than I expected." "Honest?" I raised an eyebrow. Stepping into the room, he nodded. "Yeah, it's raw. About love, attraction, all the messy parts people don't talk about." I sat down in the armchair across from him, crossing my legs and pretending his words didn't stir something inside me. "That's the point of good writing, Julian, to explore the things people are too afraid to say out loud." "And you're comfortable with all of this?" His eyes locked on mine, his tone probing. I hesitated. "It's not about comfort, it's about understanding perspectives, even if they make you uncomfortable." For a moment he said nothing, his gaze steady. Then, almost casually, he asked, "Do you think people can feel that kind of passion at any age?" I was taken aback, unsure of how to answer. "I think passion doesn't have an expiration date. Why do you ask?" He shrugged, but there was something deliberate about his nonchalance. "Just curious. It's not something people my age think about much." "You'd be surprised," I murmured, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Our eyes met again, and the air between us seemed to shift, charged with something unspoken. I quickly stood, brushing imaginary lint off my sweater. "Don't stay up too late. You've got class in the morning." "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that followed me down the hallway. The next day, I found myself replaying our conversation, dissecting his words and their possible meanings. Was he simply curious, or was there something deeper lurking beneath his questions? That evening, as I sat at my desk trying to focus on a manuscript, I heard a knock at the door. Julian stepped in, holding 2 mugs of tea. "I figured you could use a break," he said, setting one down beside me. "Thanks," I said, surprised. He lingered, his hands in his pockets. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded cautiously. "That book. Why did you decide to work on it? I mean, you could have passed it off to someone else, right?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It's personal, I guess. Not the content, but the idea of it. I think people deserve to see themselves reflected in stories no matter their age." "That makes sense," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. "But does that mean you see yourself in it?" His question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "I think everyone can relate to some part of it," I said carefully. He didn't press further, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't satisfied with my answer. Over the next week, Julian's curiosity only grew. He started asking me questions about other books I'd worked on, about my thoughts on love and relationships. At first I chalked it up to his inquisitive nature, but as his questions became more pointed, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of something more. One afternoon I caught him staring at me while I was reading on the patio. He was supposed to be studying, but his textbook lay forgotten on his lap. When I looked up, he didn't look away. "You're distracted," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Maybe," he admitted, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Is something on your mind?" He hesitated before answering. "Do you ever think about starting over? Finding someone new?" The question was so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond. "That's complicated," I said finally. "Life usually is," he replied, standing and heading inside before I could say anything more. As the days passed, I found myself increasingly aware of Julian's presence. His questions, his glances, the way he seemed to hang on my every word. It was as if he was peeling back layers I hadn't realized were there. And I couldn't deny it. I didn't hate the attention. The air had been charged between us for days now, though neither of us acknowledged it outright. The unspoken tension lingered like a static current in the house, growing stronger with every shared glance and stolen moment. That Saturday, I decided to tackle some long-overdue organizing in the library. Books were scattered across the shelves, a chaotic mixture of old novels, college textbooks, and various anthologies I'd collected over the years. I had just finished sorting a stack when Julian walked in, barefoot and casual in jeans and a gray t-shirt. "Need a hand?" he offered, his tone light. "Sure," I said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "But I'm warning you, this is a full-day project." "I've got time," he replied, stepping closer. We worked side by side for hours, exchanging easy conversation about everything from his classes to my editing projects. The tension that had clouded the air earlier seemed to dissolve as we focused on the task at hand. It felt almost normal, the kind of comfortable interaction I'd long since stopped expecting. But that comfort didn't last. As I reached for a book on the top shelf, Julian stepped forward to help. His hand brushed against mine, lingering longer than necessary. The warmth of his skin sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back as if burned, clutching the book to my chest. "Sorry," he murmured, though his voice was soft, almost tender. "It's fine," I said quickly, turning away to hide the flush spreading across my cheeks. But it wasn't fine. That brief touch had awakened something I'd been trying desperately to ignore. My heart raced, my skin tingled, and every nerve in my body seemed to come alive in a way it hadn't in years. After that moment, things changed. Julian became more attentive, finding reasons to be near me. He offered to help with chores, brought me coffee in the mornings, and lingered in the kitchen while I cooked. His presence was both comforting and unnerving, and I couldn't tell if it was intentional or if I was imagining it. One evening, I found him in the living room, sketching in a notebook. "I didn't know you drew," I said, sitting on the arm of the couch. "It's just a hobby," he replied, turning the page so I couldn't see. "Let me look," I teased, reaching for the notebook. He hesitated but handed it over, his expression unreadable. The drawings were beautiful. Portraits, landscapes, moments captured in delicate lines and shadows. But one sketch made me pause. It was a woman, her back turned, hair cascading down her shoulders. "It's stunning," I said, running my fingers over the edge of the paper. "It's you," he said quietly. I looked up, my breath catching. "Me?" he nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "I've been drawing you for weeks. You're inspiring." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I handed the notebook back, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion. I couldn't stop thinking about him. His touch, his words, the way he looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. One afternoon, I decided to confront him, to put an end to whatever was happening before it spiraled further out of control. I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a glass of water in hand. "Julian, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Okay," he said, setting the glass down and giving me his full attention. Whatever this is, it has to stop. It's not appropriate." He frowned, his brows knitting together. "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "The looks, the touches, the everything." He stepped closer, his expression softening. "Eleanor, I'm not doing anything you don't want." My breath hitched as he reached out, his fingers brushing a stray hair from my face. "If I'm wrong, tell me to stop," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I should have pulled away, should have told him he was wrong, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me, leaning into his touch as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. "Julian," I began, but whatever protest I had died on my lips as his hand cupped my cheek. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but as his lips met mine, all the reasons why seemed to fade, replaced by a heat that consumed me. When I finally pulled away, my mind was a whirlwind of guilt and desire. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "Because it's not right." "Then why didn't you stop me?" I had no answer, no defense against the truth in his words. I turned and walked away, but even as I left the room, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. Every glance, every accidental touch, every word exchanged between us seemed to carry more weight than it should. I avoided being alone with Julian as much as possible. But it didn't matter. His presence was everywhere. In my thoughts, my dreams, my waking moments. It was a rainy evening when the line was finally crossed. The sound of water pelting against the windows filled the silence as I sat in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine after a frustrating day. My work had been rejected by a particularly difficult client, and the weight of it all was pressing down on me. I didn't hear Julian enter until he was already standing in the doorway. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I looked up, startled, but quickly composed myself. "I'm fine, just a rough day." He stepped inside, his socks muffling his footsteps. "Want to talk about it?" I shook my head, trying to avoid his gaze. "No, it's nothing." He didn't leave. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his eyes searching mine. "You've been distant," he said after a moment. "I've been busy," I replied, though even I could hear the lie in my voice. "Eleanor," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Talk to me." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "It's complicated, Julian. Work, life, everything feels so heavy lately." He reached out, his hand covering mine. "You don't have to carry it alone." His touch was warm, grounding, and for a moment I allowed myself to lean into it. "I've been carrying things alone for a long time," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to anymore," he said, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I let myself see him, not as my stepson, but as the man he had become. "Julian," I began, but he interrupted me, his voice low and steady. "Tell me to leave, and I will, but if you don't want me to." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The choice was mine, and I knew what I wanted, what I'd wanted for weeks but had been too afraid to admit. I didn't tell him to leave. The first kiss was hesitant, a soft meeting of lips that sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled back, searching his eyes for doubt or hesitation, but there was none. He looked at me with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled me. When he kissed me again, it was deeper, more urgent. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as the world outside seemed to fade away. My glass of wine tipped over, spilling red liquid across the table, but neither of us cared. We didn't make it to the bedroom that night. The kitchen became our sanctuary, our secret, as we gave in to the desire that had been building between us for so long. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, the events of the night before, replaying in my mind like a dream. But it wasn't a dream. The lingering warmth on my skin, the faint scent of him on my pillow, they were all too real. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that couldn't happen again. But when Julian walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower and a small smile playing on his lips, I knew it wasn't that simple. "Morning," he said, his tone casual. "Morning," I replied, my voice wavering. He leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "Are we going to talk about last night?" "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, turning my attention to the coffee pot. "Eleanor." His voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made me stop. "Don't pretend it didn't happen." I turned to face him, my arms crossed defensively. "What do you want me to say, Julian? That it was a mistake? That it can't happen again?" "Was it a mistake?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I didn't know how to answer him, because deep down I knew it hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt inevitable. Over the next few days, we danced around each other, caught in a limbo of desire and denial. Every touch, every glance, every accidental brush of skin only added fuel to the fire. One evening, as I worked late in my study, Julian appeared in the doorway. "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice low and filled with emotion. "Julian, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "Because it's wrong? Because you're afraid of what people will think? None of that matters to me, Eleanor. You matter." His words broke through my defenses, and before I could stop myself, I was in his arms again. This time there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. As the night stretched on, the boundaries we had once adhered to disappeared entirely. The days following that night blurred together into a haze of stolen moments and quiet longing. What had started as an impulsive decision, a kiss in the kitchen on a rainy evening, evolved into something neither of us could stop. Julian and I were drawn to each other like magnets, the pull too strong to resist, no matter how wrong it felt. We became masters of secrecy. Our relationship existed in the shadows, hidden behind locked doors and whispered conversations. When the house was empty, we'd find each other in the quiet corners, where no one could intrude. My office became our sanctuary, a place where we could exist without judgment, even for a little while. I'd sit at my desk, pretending to work, while Julian stood behind me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. Sometimes he'd lean down, his lips brushing against my neck, sending shivers down my spine. Other times he'd kneel beside me, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm as we talked about everything and nothing. One particularly warm afternoon, Julian suggested we go for a drive. "Somewhere away from here," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. We ended up at a secluded park on the edge of town, where the trees formed a canopy of green above us. The world felt distant, almost unreal, as we walked hand in hand along the winding paths. "Does this feel strange to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stopped, turning to face me. "What do you mean?" "This," I gestured between us. "Us." He took a step closer, his hands finding mine. "It feels like the most real thing I've ever known." His words melted away my doubts. At least for the moment. We sat together on a wooden bench, the sound of birdsong filling the air as he wrapped his arm around my shoulders. I rested my head against him, letting myself believe, if only briefly, that this was normal. But as much as we tried to keep our affair hidden, cracks began to form in our carefully constructed facade. It started with Mrs. Harrington, our overly curious neighbor, who had an uncanny ability to appear at the most inconvenient times. One morning, as Julian left the house for class, she waved at him from her porch, a knowing smile on her face. "Julian seems to be around a lot more these days," she remarked later when I ran into her at the grocery store. "He's such a devoted stepson." Her words were innocuous, but the way she said them made my stomach churn. I smiled politely and changed the subject, but the encounter left me uneasy. Then there was Liam, Julian's best friend, who came over one evening to study. I stayed out of their way, retreating to my office, but I couldn't ignore the hushed conversation that floated through the walls. "You've been acting weird lately," Liam said. "Like, distracted." Julian's response was too quiet for me to hear, but whatever he said didn't seem to satisfy Liam. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Liam pressed. "If there's something going on." Their conversation ended abruptly when I accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on my desk. A few minutes later, Julian appeared in my doorway, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay?" I asked, forcing a smile. "Yeah," he said, though his tone was tight. "Liam's just nosy." I didn't push further, but the tension in his voice lingered in the back of my mind. Our most daring encounter happened one evening when I was supposed to meet a client at the library. The meeting was canceled at the last minute, but I decided to stay and browse. The library had always been a refuge for me, a place where I could lose myself in the quiet comfort of books. I didn't expect Julian to show up. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice a mix of surprise and delight. "I was passing by," he said with a mischievous grin. "Thought I'd find you here." We wandered through the aisles together, our shoulders brushing as we pulled books from the shelves. In a quiet corner of the library hidden from view, he kissed me, his hands cupping my face as the world outside faded away. "This is crazy," I murmured against his lips. "Maybe," he said, his voice low. "But it's ours." As the weeks went on, the stakes grew higher. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to keep our feelings hidden. Julian didn't seem to care about the risks, but I couldn't ignore them. The fear of being discovered hung over me like a storm cloud, growing darker with each passing day. It wasn't just the fear of what others would think. It was the knowledge that this couldn't last. Julian was young, with his whole life ahead of him. I was not. The age difference between us was more than just a number. It was a chasm that I knew we couldn't bridge forever. But for now, I clung to the moments we shared, savoring them like stolen treasures. I told myself that I'd end it soon, that I'd find a way to let him go before it was too late. One evening, as we lay tangled together on the couch, Julian traced circles on my arm with his fingertips. "I don't want this to end," he said quietly. "Julian, I began, but he cut me off. I mean it, Eleanor. I know it's complicated, but I don't care. I don't care about the rules or what people might think. I care about you. His words broke something inside me. I wanted to believe him, to let myself fall completely, but the voice of reason in my head wouldn't be silenced. I care about you too, I admitted, my voice trembling. But it's not sustainable. You know that. We'll figure it out, he said, his tone filled with determination. I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew the truth. Our affair was like a flame, intense, beautiful, but destined to burn out. The inevitability of discovery lingered in my mind like a shadow, but I had convinced myself we were careful enough to avoid it. It wasn't just the fear of others finding out that terrified me. It was the thought of what would happen to Julian, to us, once the delicate balance we'd maintained came crashing down. The first crack in our facade came during an unassuming afternoon. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Mrs. Harrington knocked on the door. She never visited unannounced, so her sudden appearance set my nerves on edge. I was just dropping by to return your pie dish, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And to check in on you. I've noticed Julian's car has been here a lot lately. I hope he's not giving you too much trouble. Her tone was casual, but her words carried an undertone that made my stomach tighten. No trouble at all, I said, forcing a smile. He's busy with school, but it's nice having him around. Good, she replied, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long before she handed me the dish and left. I closed the door, my heart pounding. She knew something. Maybe not the full truth, but enough to make me wary. Later that evening, Julian and I sat in the living room, the TV playing in the background. I told him about Mrs. Harrington's visit, trying to gauge his reaction. She's just nosy, he said dismissively, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his calm demeanor. It's not just her, Julian, I said, lowering my voice. People are starting to notice. We can't keep doing this. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with determination. I don't care what people think, Eleanor. I care about you. His words were meant to reassure me, but they only heightened my anxiety. Things took a sharper turn when Julian's best friend, Liam, showed up unannounced one evening. I was in my study when I heard their voices in the living room, low and intense. You've been acting weird, man, Liam said. Like, really weird. What's going on? Nothing, Julian replied, but his tone was defensive. Don't lie to me, Liam pressed. Is it about Eleanor? My breath caught. I stepped closer to the door, straining to hear. What about her? Julian asked, his voice steady but guarded. I don't know, Liam said. You just seem different when you're around her. It's like you're hiding something. Julian didn't respond, and the silence stretched on until Liam finally sighed. If there's something going on, just be careful, okay? People talk. The real unraveling began when I received a job offer from a prestigious publishing house in another state. It was the kind of opportunity I had dreamed of for years, but accepting it would mean leaving everything behind, including Julian. When I told him about the offer, his reaction was immediate. You're leaving, he asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. I haven't decided yet, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. You're running away, he accused, standing and pacing the room. Julian, this is my career, I said, struggling to make him understand. I've worked so hard for this. And what about us? He demanded, his voice breaking. There can't be an us, I said quietly. The words hung in the air like a knife between us. He stared at me, his expression a mixture of hurt and anger. In the days that followed, we barely spoke. The house felt colder, emptier, as the distance between us grew. I spent my nights poring over the details of the job offer, trying to convince myself it was the right choice. But one night, as I sat at my desk, Julian appeared in the doorway. I'm not giving up on you, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his eyes. Julian, please, I began, but he shook his head. I don't care how complicated it is, he said. I love you, Eleanor. The words hit me like a wave, overwhelming and undeniable. I wanted to tell him I loved him too, but the weight of our situation held me back. The breaking point came when I discovered that Mrs. Harrington had spoken to one of my clients during a chance encounter at the grocery store. She mentioned something about your stepson living with you, my client said casually during a phone call. She seemed curious about your dynamic. I hung up, my hands trembling. It was only a matter of time before the rumors spread further, before our secret became public knowledge. When Julian came home that evening, I told him everything. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice breaking. "It's too risky." "Eleanor, I don't care what people think," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "But I do," I replied, tears streaming down my face. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. He stepped closer, his hands cupping my face as he whispered, "I can't lose you." "You never had me to begin with," I said, the words cutting deeper than I intended. The confrontation left us both shattered. Julian retreated to his room, and I spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd let things go so far. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. The morning after my sleepless night, I resolved to put an end to everything. The affair, the secrecy, the moments that had made me feel alive for the first time in years. It all had to stop. The risk was too great, and the damage we'd cause, too profound. Julian emerged from his room just as I finished pouring myself a cup of coffee. His hair was disheveled, and the dark circles under his eyes mirrored my own exhaustion. "We need to talk," I said, setting the cup down. "I know," he replied, his voice subdued. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air. "This can't continue," I began, my hands trembling as I clasped them together. "It's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me." "Fair?" he echoed, his tone laced with frustration. "Since when has any of this been about fairness?" "Julian." "No, let me finish," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I know this isn't conventional. I know people wouldn't understand. But I don't care about them. I care about us." His words stirred something deep within me, a mixture of longing and regret, but I couldn't let myself be swayed. "There is no us," I said softly, my voice breaking. This was a mistake. His expression shifted, the hurt in his eyes cutting me to the core. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice trembling. "I do," I lied, forcing the words out even as my heart screamed otherwise. "You need to move on, Julian. Find someone your age, someone who can give you the life you deserve." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get to decide what I deserve," he said, his voice sharp with anger. I watched helplessly as he stormed out of the house, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in months, the house felt unbearably empty. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting to Julian, where he'd gone, what he was thinking, whether I'd made the right choice. Hours passed with no word from him. I resisted the urge to call, telling myself he needed time to process everything. But as night fell, my worry grew. Finally, just past midnight, the sound of the front door opening startled me from my restless thoughts. I rushed to the living room, relief flooding through me when I saw Julian standing there, his shoulders slumped and his expression weary. "Where have you been?" I demanded, unable to hide the concern in my voice. "Out," he replied curtly, avoiding my gaze. "Julian, I'm done talking," he said, cutting me off. "I get it, Eleanor. You don't want this. You don't want me." His words were like a dagger to my chest, but I didn't correct him. How could I, when I'd already made my decision? He walked past me, heading to his room without another word. The sound of his door closing was like the final nail in the coffin of whatever we'd shared. The next few days were agonizing. Julian barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were clipped and distant. The house felt colder, emptier, as if the life had been drained from it. I threw myself into work, hoping it would distract me, but even that proved futile. My thoughts were consumed by memories of him, his touch, his smile, the way he'd looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered. One evening, I received an unexpected phone call from the publishing house offering me the job. The editor on the other end was warm and enthusiastic, outlining the details of the position and emphasizing how much they were looking forward to having me on board. "It's a big opportunity," she said. "We hope you'll accept." I thanked her and promised to give them my decision soon, but as I hung up, the weight of the choice before me felt suffocating. That night, Julian confronted me. "I saw the email," he said, standing in the doorway of my study. "What email?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "The one about the job," he said, stepping inside. "You're taking it, aren't you?" I sighed, setting down my pen. "Julian, this isn't about you. Of course it's about me," he said, his voice rising. You're running away because of what happened between us. I'm taking the job because it's a good opportunity, I said firmly. This has nothing to do with you. Stop lying, he said, his tone raw with emotion. You're scared, Eleanor. Scared of what people will think. Scared of how much you feel for me. His words hit too close to the truth, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. You're wrong, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Am I? He challenged, stepping closer. Tell me you don't feel anything for me. Tell me last night meant nothing. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive. I thought so, he said, his voice softening. You can lie to yourself all you want, but you can't lie to me. Julian left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the email on my computer screen, the cursor blinking as if waiting for me to make a decision. I knew what I had to do. The day I left was gray and overcast, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier. I had packed my things quietly, not wanting to disturb Julian. He had barely spoken to me since our last argument, and part of me hoped the silence was his way of letting me go. The publishing house had arranged for a moving service to help me settle into my new home. As I loaded the last box into the car, I paused, glancing back at the house. The memories of the past months played in my mind like a film reel. The laughter, the arguments, the stolen moments that had defined us. Julian appeared in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked tired, his usual confidence replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. You're really going, he said, his voice flat. I nodded, unsure of what to say. For what it's worth, he continued, stepping closer. I don't regret any of it. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Neither do I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything we couldn't say hanging between us. Finally, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. Take care of yourself, Julian, I said, tears welling in my eyes. You too, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to say more, to tell him how much he had meant to me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I got into the car and drove away, leaving behind the house, the memories, and the man I had fallen for. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, deadlines, and adjusting to my new life. The job was everything I had hoped for, challenging and fulfilling in ways I hadn't experienced in years. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't shake the emptiness that had settled in my chest. Every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about Julian, wondering what he was doing, if he was happy, if he thought of me as often as I thought of him. One evening, as I walked through the city, I passed by a bookstore. In the window was a display of novels, their colorful covers beckoning passers-by. My eyes landed on one title in particular, Desires of the Middle-Aged Heart. I couldn't help but smile, the memory of that fateful day flooding back. That book had been the catalyst, the spark that had ignited something neither of us could have anticipated. I stepped inside, running my fingers along the spines of the books as I wandered through the aisles. For a moment, I let myself imagine a different version of our story, one where the world wasn't so complicated, where we could have been together without fear or judgment. But life wasn't a storybook, and happy endings weren't guaranteed. As the months turned into years, I carried the memory of Julian with me like a keepsake tucked away in a drawer. I didn't dwell on it, but it never truly faded. It was a reminder of what it meant to feel alive, to take risks, to love without reservation, even when the odds were stacked against you. Looking back, I realized that what we had wasn't about right or wrong. It was about being human, flawed, vulnerable, and desperately searching for connection in a world that often felt too big and too cold. And though our time together was fleeting, it was real. It mattered.